Peace, y'all. This is Marcus Sunjata Brown, coming to you with the last installment in my Nkrumah biography video series. So in previous videos, we talked about Nkrumah's ascent from a humble student and organizer in the United States and England to the leadership of the Convention People's Party of the Gold Coast, and ultimately to the head of state of newly independent Ghana in 1957. We also addressed some of the internal and external contradictions that Ghana had to face during its independence in the lead up to the 1966 coup. So, for example, the petty bourgeois and tribal leadership of the people of Ghana internally cooperating with the external or the force of external contradiction, which was the reaction of the imperialist world that was organized into the NATO bloc, okay? And that was increasingly distrustful of Nkrumah and suspicious of his socialistic leanings and his desire for real independence for African people. Okay. We also talked about some of the moves toward unity that he took. So we spoke, for example, of his attempt in 1960 to unite in a kind of common government with the Congo under Patrice Lumumba, and how he sent an army into the Congo to try to save that government. To also preserve the secret agreement between himself and Lumumba. We also talked about the relationship that he had with Ahmed Sékou Touré, the head of state of Guinea, and that he was trying to establish with Modibo Keïta before the Gaullists in France stopped that from working out, right, or prevented that that political union from taking place with Mali, right? So Nkrumah was always working out different strategies for political unification of African leaders, right? He wasn't concerned in just preserving his private fiefdom in Ghana, like some of the other leaders like Houphouët-Boigny of the Ivory Coast tried to do. He was genuinely interested in the consolidation of these balkanized African states for economic and political and cultural shared development. This effort in 1963 culminated in the Organization of African Unity, which is the precursor to the African Union. Now, in a later video series dealing with the history of Pan-Africanism and its vicissitudes on the continent and the diaspora, I want to address some of the contradictions of the Organization of African Unity. And the leading contradiction is, of course, that it is a union of African leaders or African heads of state. It is not a union of the great masses of African or of the African continent. And this is obviously relevant because somebody who is a neo-colonial leader or president can join the OAU and then have the trappings of Pan-Africanism, but they're not actually coordinating economically or ceding their political power to this larger union. Whereas the masses of Africa have a real material interest in the unification of the continent for coordinated economic development, right? And for the dissolution of these irrational colonial boundaries that keep peoples that were once united separated into distinct political territories, okay? So the West was very afraid of all of the moves that Nkrumah was making. And we talked about how there were 5 assassination attempts against him beginning in 1958. The last assassination attempt in January 1964 led to a constitutional amendment. So there was an amendment to the Ghanaian constitution that said that the only legal party in that nation was the Convention People's Party. So from 1964 on, Ghana would be a one-party state. Now, there are some people who have a lot of criticisms of this. And let me just say, as an Nkrumahist, I consider myself a critical Nkrumahist. And part of the reason for this is that I do unite with Frantz Fanon's analysis of the pitfalls of the one-party state, of its tendencies toward degeneration, and of its utility for neo-colonial plots. Okay? But we also have to keep in mind that it's one thing to criticize how things ought to be. It's another thing to reckon with the way that things are, okay? And the danger to the unity of the nation for Nkrumah and for the CPP was that serious, right? 5 assassination attempts, political and economic isolation, right? The sabotage of attempts at unifying different progressive African governments, that this kind of dissent in that climate would have been very hard to tolerate. It would either weaken the Convention People's Party, making it less able to carry out its work of development of Ghana and of unity for the African continent in the face of the reaction within the country, or it would just lend itself to the proliferation of reactionary, petty bourgeois-oriented parties like the United Party or the UGCC, right? So it's very hard to take a position that he should have done this or he should have done that, right? Hindsight is 20/20. But I'll say more about what I mean by critical Nkrumahism or a critical approach to Nkrumahism that is enriched by the insights of Fanon, Cabral, C.L.R. James, and other revolutionary theorists and activists in my video series on Nkrumahism itself, okay? So this led to a number of further complications within the country, right? Because now the opponents of Nkrumah's progressive government could say, look, this dude is a dictator. He's a Stalinist, right? We need your help, CIA, MI5, to overthrow this guy and to install genuine democracy in this country. So that was one issue. Another issue was the real bureaucratic degeneration of the Convention People's Party after 1964. I mean, there were already elements of class struggle within the Convention People's Party before that. But, C.L.R. James, Basil Davidson, and a number of other sympathetic sources point out that there was genuine bureaucratic degeneration and there were genuine instances of electoral fraud on a local, at a local level in Ghana from 1964. Even though the CPP didn't really need it, there were genuine instances of electoral fraud. Nkrumah didn't necessarily have anything to do with these, right? But the fact is that there is a right-wing tendency and a left-wing tendency in almost any political formation that you can imagine. There's always going to be contradictions. We live in a world that's structured by class. Therefore, contradictions around class are going to manifest in political formations. And this is, of course, what happened with the CPP. Right? And when the petty bourgeoisie don't have an alternative, or they see that the CPP has the momentum with the masses, and these other organizations are really marginal and unimportant, to the great majority, they're going to join the CPP in order to advance their particular class interests under the guise of African liberation and economic progressivism. Okay, but there were also a couple of other external factors, right, such as the massive foreign debt that Ghana had accrued, because we did mention before that one of the conditions for the formal or political independence of Ghana was that certain neo-colonial economic structures remained intact. Now, Nkrumah's strategy was to actually to race against time by developing economically Ghana and the other African nations toward independence from the imperialist world. But obviously by 1964, 1965, this was becoming an increasingly distant possibility through the non-aligned strategy that Nkrumah had advanced up to that point. So he was being pushed increasingly toward the Soviet Union for aid. Now, there was another issue that was connected with these neo-colonial mechanisms, which is that the cocoa trade, which was the most important trade for Ghana, and before that the Gold Coast under the colonial economy, that the cocoa trade was effectively controlled, and the bulk of the profits went to the British, to British stakeholders in their home country, right? So because so much of the working masses of Ghana were dependent on the cocoa trade, when there was a world downturn in cocoa prices, this was cataclysmic, because they already, under these neo-colonial conditions, were working more and more and producing more and more cocoa for the West, but they were seeing diminishing returns for more work that they were putting in. Okay, so this is a common dynamic within neo-colonial economies. The harder that people work, the less of the reward that they see from the work that they're doing, because they're actually reinforcing the mother country economy and reinforcing its bargaining power over their own quote unquote their own governments. Okay, so all of this led to popular dissatisfaction with the status quo, if it didn't necessarily mean dissatisfaction with Kwame Nkrumah, and at least with the left wing of the Convention People's Party. But the real watershed moment was the publication in 1965 of Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, which was a development of the themes that we are already familiar with from Towards Colonial Freedom from 1947, right? So he updated his analysis of imperialism along Leninist lines to talk about the neo-colonial circumstance that the Western nations in the NATO bloc could use their existing economic control in these newly independent countries to maintain the existing economic relationship between the first and third worlds. Okay, he didn't use that language. I'll say more about Nkrumah and the third world concept in the next series. Okay, but this is what he was acknowledging and laying out for the revolutionary intelligentsia and organizers on the African continent and in the diaspora. And in that book, he points to the United States in particular as the major hegemonic power in this era of neo-colonialism that coordinates the other Western nations in common robbery of the African nations. Okay, so the United States obviously was not pleased with this. They were already alarmed by many of the choices that Nkrumah made. But this was for them the death knell of peaceable relations with Nkrumah and with the CPP, right? So in 1965, the United States withdrew $25 million in potential aid to Ghana. Okay, so you can see that the economic situation was already dire. Now it's approaching a real crisis. Okay, that the reactionary forces within the country could exploit to their advantage. So Nkrumah, being a genuine internationalist, planned a trip to Vietnam, or to support Vietnam in a formal show of goodwill, right, against the imperialist aggressors who wanted to maintain possession of Southeast Asia. So February 24th, 1966, the military and police staged a coup against Nkrumah while he was out of the country, because these cowardly would-be leaders were too afraid to do this while he was at home, while he could maintain a connection with the genuinely revolutionary forces in his country. All right. So from February 24th, 1966, Nkrumah was in exile. Okay. First he actually went to Guinea, right? And in Guinea, in recognition of the ties that he had established with Ahmed Sékou Touré, he was made the co-president. He also began to rethink a lot of the ideas of the tactics and strategy of organizing for Pan-Africanism during this period, right? And came out with a number of works that reflected the growing tendency toward armed struggle against coups d'etat and against puppet leadership on the African continent, right? And, you know, the struggles against classic and settler colonialism that you saw or that you saw with the PAIGC, that you saw with Robert Mugabe, that you saw with the MPLA, and so on. Okay, so he released a number of works such as Class Struggle in Africa, Dark Days in Ghana, and the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. So I'll say something more about each of these in the series on Nkrumahism. But just speaking to the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, now Nkrumah was talking about the need for an all-African people's revolutionary army, which would be composed of the broad masses, and that would coordinate across national lines, strategy, resources, troops, weapons, to overthrow these puppet regimes that were mushrooming throughout the continent during the 60s. Okay? And also the need for an all-African People's Revolutionary Party as the political mechanism to coordinate these struggles and give them ideological direction. Okay? So his thinking from 1966 is very much in line with Cabral, with Mugabe, with even Fanon, who he had contradictions with before. So this is really, I don't want to call it a sea change. It's actually a rational development from his previous approach, because we did mention that, you know, force, revolutionary force for Nkrumah is always an option on the table. Now he's saying this is the time where, you know, we need to have armed struggle throughout the entire continent. Okay. Unfortunately, while he was abroad, Nkrumah developed prostate cancer, and he passed away on April 27th, 1972, in Bucharest, Romania, where he was undergoing treatment. Okay, but his legacy lives forever, right? This is the person who devised the strategy and tactics of mass organization against classic colonialism on the continent, right? This is the person who gave the most systematic and carefully thought out articulation of the theoretical and ideological problems of African liberation through works like consciencism, neo-colonialism, and class struggle in Africa. This is also the person who, while he was president, surreptitiously worked with the most revolutionary and uncompromising opponents of colonialism on the continent, right? So, for example, Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, back when he was a genuine revolutionary, got his training as a guerrilla in Ghana, below the radar, right? There was another liberation fighter who received training in Ghana named Cabral, Amilcar Cabral, right? And on the occasion of Nkrumah's funeral, he actually delivered a eulogy that I think is a perfect summation of Nkrumah's relevance for the last quarter of the 20th century and his relevance for this century now, right? So I just want to close with this quote. President Nkrumah is the consummate strategist, inventor of African positivism, positive action, and an implacable foe of neo-colonialism. We absolutely despise those who could stoop to betray Nkrumah to please imperialism. We pay tribute to the declared enemy of neo-colonialism in Africa and elsewhere, the strategist of economic development in his own country. Nkrumah will resuscitate each dawn in the hearts and in the determinations of freedom fighters, in the action of all true patriots. Okay? And to that, all I can add is forward to a united socialist Africa, forward to a liberated third world, forward to the liberation of all of oppressed and exploited humanity.